I'm one of the organizers for this symposium today. Welcome to the second session of the Envisioning Next Generation Radiation Governance Symposium, commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. The symposium is organized to provide an opportunity to reflect on past and future radiation governance, recognized as a transnational, transdisciplinary, and transgenerational challenge and responsibility. We are here commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. The symposium extends from and supports the ongoing work of the Radiation Governance Working Group in the Disaster SDS network. It is also sponsored by the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, San Francisco, UCLA's Terasaki Center for Japanese Studies, and the University of California, Irvine Department of Anthropology. One goal is to bring people together involved in different aspects of radiation governance, connecting efforts related to uranium mining and processing, weapons testing, nuclear power generation, food safety, radiation medicine, and so on. Another goal is to foreground diverse approaches to the radiation governance stemming from diverse histories, foregrounding initiatives in Japan and the United States. Each panel will be a moderated discussion among differently situated experts with time for questions from the audience. And for the audience, we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A box of our chat. Rather in the Q&A box and not in the chat. Our panel today will focus on archives, museums, and other memory practices. The panel next week will focus on radiation regulation, followed by a panel about creative interdisciplinary radiation education programs, and closing with a panel in which we'll explore different ways of teaching about and governing particular places dealing with radiation hazards. In keeping with our commitment to acknowledge the history and continuing vibrancy of the native lands on which we operate at UCLA and UCI, we'll now move to a land acknowledgement, noting that this is a memory practice of the sort we will focus on in our sessions today. A memory and practice intended to keep the past alive and present in our imaginations, helping us to envision the future and next generation radiation governance with a combination of historical, planetary, and place-focused perspectives.
Thank you very much, Nadine, and hello. My name is Tim Schütz. I'm speaking to you from Taipei as part of the Symposium organizing group. Welcome, everyone. Our Radiation Governance Symposium acknowledges the Hiroshima Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tuvangar, the Los Angeles Basin, Southern Channel Islands, including the region from the Santa Ana River to Aliso Creek and beyond. It is the ancestral homeland of the Tongva, the Hiroshima, the Chumash, the Tatavian, the Kahila nations, the Chemuvi, the Pipa Ahamakav, the Morongo, the Pachanga, the Yohavitan, the Soboba, among many other peoples. The greater Los Angeles area is also home to the largest indigenous populations in the US, with large communities of indigenous peoples from the Greater Turtle Island, the Pacific Islands, and Central and South America, including Zapotec and Mixtec peoples. We acknowledge that Los Angeles is also a place with large communities of Two-Spirit peoples who organize and fellowship with each other. We acknowledge colonization as an ongoing process. The need to continue repairing the harm caused to indigenous peoples around the world, and a special need to better govern radiation hazards in indigenous communities.
Thank you, Tim. Hello, I'm Kim Fortune and another of the symposium organizers. In this session, we'll be exploring the importance and design of infrastructure supporting radiation memory, understanding, and governance, We'll discuss archives, museums, and art projects built to document the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Fukushima disaster, and ongoing US militarism in the Pacific. We will discuss archives and other memory projects organized by governments, universities, diverse groups, and individuals, and the different logics of remembrance built into them. We will also discuss what has not been archived, what has been erased, and the kind of archives, museums, and educational programs we need to build to support next generation radiation governance. Our panels have diverse experience with archives, but there are no professional archivists among them, though we consider professional archivists crucial partners in the work we envision going forward. Today, we will discuss archives, museums, and other memory projects very expansively, explicating how they make the history they document with profound cultural and political effects. Our panelists have rich insight on this from diverse vantage points. Ryo Morimoto is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Princeton University and previously the project manager of the Japan Disaster Digital Archive, a project of Harvard's Reichhauser Institute of Japan Studies. Professor Morimoto's research examines ways of living with nuclear things and the special challenges of experiencing and representing low-dose radiation. He's working on a book tentatively titled The Nuclear Ghost, Atomic Livelihood in Fukushima's Gray Zone. His previous work provided theoretical perspective on different ways of remembering the past. Hiroko Takahashi is professor of cultural history at Nara University, specializing in the history of US-Japan relations and what she terms global hibakusha, including those exposed to the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as those exposed during nuclear development and testing beyond Japan. Professor Takahashi has co-authored books about the post-war history of nuclear development and about future responsibility for an array of nuclear legacies and practices. A key concern throughout Professor Takahashi's work is with ways official archives delimit what is known about the atomic bomb radiation and ways nuclear developments of the past shape lives today. Our third panelist, Sharon Trowick, is professor of gender studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, with affiliations in anthropology, history, the Terasaki Center for Japanese Studies, and the Center for Study of Women. Professor Trowick has studied particle physics communities in Japan and the United States and is the author of Beam Times and Lifetimes, The World of High Energy Physicists. She also has studied knowledge practices and infrastructures in many other fields, drawing out the cultural dimensions, delimitations, and erasures of all knowledge production. In 2020, Professor Trowick received the Society for Social Studies of Science's highest honor, the Brunel Prize for career-spanning contributions to the interdisciplinary field of science and technology studies. Our fourth panelist, John Mitchell, is an award-winning British journalist based in Japan. He is author of multiple Japanese language books and articles about toxic contamination in Japan resulting from military operations. His 2020 English language book, Poisoning the Pacific, documents decades of US military contamination of the Pacific with nerve agents, Agent Orange, and radiation, impacting veterans, other workers, and residents, including many indigenous communities. The book is based on interviews and over 12,000 pages of documents obtained through US Freedom of Information Act request from the US CIA, Department of Defense, and State Department. These documents are now publicly available through Okinawa International University's library, George Washington University, and the University of Hawaii. In 2015, Mr. Mitchell was awarded the Foreign Correspondent Club of Japan's Freedom of the Press Lifetime Achievement Award for his investigation into human rights issues on Okinawa. Thanks to all of the panelists for joining us. We'll now proceed with the questions we've planned to start with. Please share the questions you have in the Zoom Q&A.
Hello, I'm delighted to ask the first question, which is, Can you share your recent work building, using, and providing access to our archives? Hiroko, would you be able to start with this presentation, please?
Yes. Can I show some pictures? Can I share? Oh,
Yes.
sorry. It's disappearing. Can you see this picture?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So maybe you know this is the famous withdrawal notice. I found this withdrawal notice from the when I researched at the National Archives at College Park and research about the Atomic Energy Commission biological medical documents. And it said that access restricted, and it said that Japan General 1951, 54, and the date is 1954, December 28th. So this is a very, very important date because the almost next year's January 1st, Japanese government received some money from the United States government for the some ex gratia payment for the bikini suffering. So this timing is very important, but this document was withdrawn. So so I requested FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, and then this document was declassified. So through this document, we could not, the Foreign Minister, the Shigemitsu and Ambassador Allison made the meeting in 1954, December 27th, and they talk about the settlement of bikini compensation program, but simultaneously they talked about the release of parole of war criminal. So they under the negotiation, they talk about simultaneously like the settlement of bikini compensation and the release of war criminal. So I think that these are very historically important documents, and also I really wanted to check the Japanese side documents, and so I requested Japanese Foreign Ministry FOIA in the 2018, and this document was declassified. It said that so I realized that this the compensation for damage caused by nuclear test in the Marshall Islands, a very similar memoir, and the release of parole of war criminal in it also said like this. So the Foreign Minister Shigemitsu is he just became the Foreign Minister in December, and he is very minister at the Tojo administration during World War II, and he was expressed as a prison as a war criminal. So it seems me that as as the person who have war criminal experience, he really wanted to release the war criminal. So I found this document. So, and I realized that even now, many important documents which relate to the bikini compensation is still classified. So this is the latest work that I found now. Thank you.
Thank you. Same question, Dr. Trowick, will you answer that, please?
Yes, first I want to say that in my work with archives, the historian in me goes to places called archives, but also I study what goes into an archive, what kind of data are saved, and who defines what gets saved, and who has access and how is it used. And I also look for, as we were just hearing from Professor Takahashi, how does something get archived in an official place, and how is it kept secret, and how is it eventually opened up? I think to look at an archive as a kind of memory bank, and I want to generalize to think what is public memory, what is private memory, what are the various ways that we archive the past? Is it in songs, in poetry? Is it a diary? Is it a family album? So whose archive is it? Whose memory is it? Is it public? Is it private? Is it authoritative? Is it secret? And so on. Those are the kinds of questions that I ask. And I'm going to give an example of some data that I thought would be available. Before I begin, I'll just say I'm fine now, so don't worry. But several years ago, I had breast cancer. And before I was to begin radiation treatment, I asked my doctors asked me if I had any workplace related experience with radiation. And I said, yes, from all my experience studying high energy physics laboratories, studying experimentalists. I often carried, if you've never seen it, it's about the size of a credit card, called a dosimeter that measures your exposure to radiation. So my doctor asked me to find out from my workplaces what my exposure had been over my lifetime at work. And I contacted the 3 laboratories where I had done the most work. And in one of them, they said that at the time that I was working for them, that they were keeping paper records and that they had not digitized all that stuff yet. It was going to be very hard for them to get back to me. The second place told me that they had digitized their old records and they found a little bit about me and they sent it. And the third place said, you were never here. And that was a lab in Japan. And I thought that was kind of funny. So I contacted some of the physicists I had studied over the years and the grants that I had gotten and so forth, and cataloged the exact times that I'd been at the lab since 1976. And the record keepers kept saying I was never there. And finally, we found out what the problem was. I was not there on funding granted by the agency in charge of the laboratory. So they had no records. So from their point of view, as a funding agency, I didn't exist. Hence my records, my dosimeters didn't exist. Even though I had been granted dosimeters by a different branch of the laboratory and I had turned them into different branches of the laboratory. So that's an example of a kind of information discarded in some cases or not available in others, but also not even bothered to collect by the people who were in charge of the archive. Now, I eventually found some people in different branches of the laboratory who did have some records, but they weren't part of the regular archive. So just as Professor Takahashi was explaining about what gets kept, what's secret, and at different intervals, what gets exposed and what doesn't get exposed over long periods of time. Again, I'm very interested in what never gets collected in the first place or what gets considered to be official, what is archived properly and officially. and what is pushed to the side under which criteria. And that led me to the question of all of the radiation workers in Japan right now around Fukushima, and what kind of documentation about them is going on, and who is collecting the health records about them. And they are not official employees of the official agency in charge. They are part-time workers, and the people responsible for keeping records of them, we won't have those records in the future. So we need to keep track of who's keeping track and why. And what are all the different kinds of archives? How might we go sideways and find other records? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Morimoto, can you share your recent work building, using, and providing access to archives?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. As Professor Fortune mentioned, that I used to work for the Japan Disasters Digital Archive at the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies. This work involved basically concerning the triple disasters in Japan, and in the context of digital age. So slightly different from the two panelists before me that talked about the historical record, right? The one that I had to deal with is the digital records, most of which were what we call born digital. So there is no physical version of the particular thing, like a website, some of the tweets, Facebook message, all this kind of stuff. Yeah, so my work involved trying to figure out like what's the best way to, first of all, to try to preserve those digital records, what are the kind of infrastructure needed in order to make it accessible for a wide variety of people. So I worked in that particular context, and currently I work with a project called Nuclear Princeton with a group of undergraduate Indigenous students on campus. There are not that many in Princeton. I work with 8 of them, and I think that's probably 90% of them or something. But this project is basically about thinking of the connection between the university and its involvement in the project to make the world nuclear and the impact on the indigenous communities and in their land. But as Sharon was talking about here, I'm kind of concerned about like whose archive, whose website this is. And I basically facilitate the project in the sense that it's the students who actually think about, read and confront the data we can find and interpret and then create their own story from their point of view. So I'm kind of like here trying to use the archive as a place to generate alternative narrative to what we've been told about, the nuclear energy or the weapons or the atomic age and all that. But I think there are other questions coming up and other panelists too. So I'll just stop here for now.
Thank you so much. Mr. Mitchell, would you please share your recent work in building, using, and providing access to archives?
First of all, thank you very, very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My main research, it centers on Okinawa. And I think a lot of people, they don't have much knowledge about Okinawa. So if I could just share just a real basic background of the history of Okinawa, so you can understand why I created the archives that I did. So between 1945 and 1972, Okinawa was an American military colony. And during that time, it had one of the largest stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction on the planet. Okinawa had more than 1,000 nuclear warheads. There were 13,000 tons of chemical weapons, such as sarin, VX, and mustard agent. And also the Pentagon, it tested biological weapons on rice fields on Okinawa as well. So you can really see that Okinawa needs to be understood in this context of colonialism and this context of weapons of mass destruction in the same way that the Marshall Islands, Johnston Atoll, is understood today. During the Cold War, Okinawa was used for wars in Vietnam. Also, it was used for the Korean War before that. And this really heavy usage of Okinawa, it created extensive environmental contamination throughout the island. We know that in the United States, military bases are contaminated, but there is a degree of transparency within the United States. The EPA goes onto the bases and checks, and information is publicly available. But when it comes to Japan, when it comes to Okinawa, there is no such transparency. So the Japanese government is not allowed into American bases to check for contamination. So my job as an investigative journalist is to use the Freedom of Information Act to research the environmental impact of military operations, especially on Okinawa. There are 31 US bases on Okinawa today. So for the past probably about 5 years, I've been using FOIA, and I've put my FOIA records into 4 archives. First of all, at Okinawa International University, there is the bulk of my FOIA documents related to Okinawa. Also, I've donated documents to Okinawa Prefectural Archives and University of Hawaii, and also George Washington University has some of the key documents that I've collected. So just really briefly, I'd like to take you through the main points of those archives, and I can answer any questions that you have in Q&A as well. So it's a 4-disc archive collection, and it totals around about 5,500 pages. The first disc, it looks at contamination, environmental contamination from the military on Okinawa. Those documents were released under FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. They come from the CIA, they come from the branches of the American military, and they come from the State Department as well. These documents date from 1945 to 2017, and they include general contamination from conventional munitions and also from depleted uranium, also chemical, biological weapons. And during the Vietnam War, Okinawa was used extensively to fight that war. And it really created severe contamination on Okinawa. And today, the island remains severely contaminated. And these documents show where that contamination is located. Disc 2 is the archaeological, cultural, and natural surveys of current military facilities on Okinawa. You've got to understand that in the 1950s, the American military, they forcibly seized the land of Okinawan people. By 1955, about 1/3 of Okinawans were dispossessed from their land by the American military to build new bases. And so these surveys, they are showing the history of the bases, the current bases. They show the number of tombs, they show the number of sacred sites for indigenous Okinawans, they show where these villages were located. Disc number 3 is training manuals from the CIA and training manuals from the United States Marine Corps. And these training manuals are for Americans, how Americans should understand, and I put that word in quotation marks, understand Okinawa, and also how Americans can influence public opinion about Okinawa. The CIA report was part of a series of how to manipulate public opinion. One of them was about Afghanistan, one of them was about Al-Qaeda, one of them was about Syria. And it's very telling that one of them was about Okinawa. And this handbook is designed for American policymakers to manipulate public opinion about Okinawa. And the final disc is disc 4. And this is not released by FOIA. This was released by one American soldier who gave me his photographs from the aftermath of Okinawa's largest riot, the Koza riot, which occurred in 1970. And before he passed away, he asked me to make these photographs as widely available as possible. So I included them in these archives with the hope that many people can access them. So that kind of gives you an overview of the archives that I've been creating for the past 4 or 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for those questions. Our next question turns to the challenges of creating these archives. So we'd like you to share the challenges you faced, be it technical challenges, political challenges, pushback for the kind of work you do, challenges of legality, any kind of challenges that will help us think about the work of building archives and what work they can do in the future. So Professor Trowick, can you please start us off here?
Yes, please. In my studies, trying to understand how knowledge is made, I found that a lot of the archives, the research available to me by other people, the documents saved, was about famous scientists doing famous work. And I wanted to study the everyday process of making knowledge. So gradually I got involved with collecting oral histories from not the famous people in the labs, but all of the other people in the labs, and helping, and then trying to encourage a kind of archiving of those oral histories in various places. And various people I work with, we've collected about 900 of these oral histories of scientists, especially focusing on the women, the minorities, and the immigrants who work in these laboratories, the ordinary people. And one thing that I found is that at a lot of these laboratories, in addition to the records about the most famous people, there's also a lot of information about the funding that came into the labs and all of the stuff that they built with it, all the research equipment and the buildings for the research equipment, plus all of the scholarly articles that were generated from all the research. So there's a lot of income and outgo, but not much about the process in between. So I've been trying to develop this information through these oral histories plus these archives. I'd like to say something about my searches for other information about ordinary people. In some of these interviews with the elders in the scientific community I was studying in Japan, when I'd ask them when did they first think about becoming a physicist, when did they first think that there was a political dimension to physics? Some of the elders mentioned 1954 and the bombing on the 1st of March. We're just past another anniversary. 1954 in the Marshall Islands, sometimes better known in the US as the Bikini Atoll bombing. And I became interested in how that event was commemorated. And through the physicists I was interviewing in Japan, they told me more and more about this ship.
Yeah. Lucky Dragon number 5.
Yes. And eventually it led me to, I found that there was a museum in Tokyo. It's built on a landfill site. One of the things I was just teaching about earlier today is toxic sites. There's some very interesting museums on that toxic landfill in Tokyo. And another is museum to the firebombing during World War II. But back to the Bikini Atoll and this ship and all the kinds of memorial practices. It's an interesting museum. I've looked at the funding of it. It's rather vulnerable as an institution. And that in turn led me to looking for how the Marshallese people have been memorializing their knowledge. Maybe you know that we were speaking earlier, Rio and Tim were both speaking about colonial practices, that the Marshall Islands have had a company there from the Tyson Chicken Company. They also have their headquarters in a lot of industry in Arkansas. Eventually, a lot of Marshallese people went to Arkansas to work in the Tyson chicken factories in Arkansas. And it turns out that every year they have a memorial practice about the bombings, about the test bomb in the Marshall Islands. And so very interested in their commemoration practices of the bombings and how they pass down that knowledge every year through these commemoration events. So that those practices repeated, they started in 2013, how those practices are transmitting knowledge across the generations of the community knowledge, as this community has been in migration, but also their migration has been very tightly correlated with the role of the US government in their movements. So, sorry, I should have said, John also mentioned the colonial practices. So how does memory of something like the bombings and the radiation effects in the Marshall Islands, commemorated in Japan from this group of fishermen on this boat who were not warned, and the Marshallese now remembering Tokyo memories, and also the memories in the oral histories of the physicists who said that this was the beginning of shaping their careers as scientists. So how would we assemble all of that into an archive of Bikini Atoll and nuclear testing? Thank you.
Thank you. Rio, can you follow?
Yeah, question about challenges. I have so many and I can spend a long time, but I'll just delimit my conversation a couple of things. Like first of all, like very much of the realistic concern is the cost. It costs a lot of money, not only for building a system, whether it be a website or other type of platform, but it costs a lot of time. Also costs a lot of time for the curatorial work. Somebody has to go and curate materials. And then not only that, you have to provide what they call metadata, right? The keywords for those items to be searchable. To build an infrastructure of an archive, and especially in the current world, mostly the digital platform, it would cost a lot of money. So the project I worked with at Harvard is what we call crisis archiving. Which is slightly different from other kind of archiving in the sense that there is not much time to think about which item to collect. The assumption is like, well, we just have to collect whatever is possible because nobody knows what can become significant and later, right? There will be a lot of work involved in collecting the items, and then somebody has to sit down and say like, well, what are we going to do about those things, right? The Harvard archive was interesting in the sense that because of the location far away from Japan, there was no way for us to be able to go in and gather data. So what we did is that we identified many groups who had been already working on the project like that, and we decided to become a portal site to enable people to access their data via using our platform. So our archive, in a way, that focused on thinking about who might be using this and what's the best way that data can be used, something that the people on the ground didn't have time to think about. And I think I'll address this kind of question later, but one of the biggest challenge for us as in between sort of institution that provided access to somebody else's data was the legal issue. Even though it's a virtual world, it's between two different countries, and sometimes Japan group had to follow Japanese legal conventions, while the US might have a different rules. And one of the biggest thing, the difference is the thing called rights of likeness in Japan, which is basically the people's right to not to show their faces or reveal identity. So quickly we realized many of the data being shared by the Japanese partners lacked any images of humans, which was very problematic, especially for the US side. If you go to, for example, 9/11 Museum, you probably see it's the story of humans, right? Whereas the Japanese disaster archive, it was the story of wrecked infrastructures, about the damages to the physical materials and why not. That was mostly because they couldn't deal with this legal hurdles on their own, and they didn't know what to do about it. Some archive decided to basically hide the faces of the pictures. So they show those pictures in the archive, but their faces are blurred. That just means that there is no consent being given by the particular individual. Then the problem was like, okay, data was curated in some point in the past and then shared in the present moment, and then nobody could go back and then trace, well, who took the pictures, who were in the pictures, were they even alive, and all this kind of stuff. Right, so there are a lot of legal issues that one needs to think about. And then finally, I'll quickly mention about the political issue. That is, a portal site like Harvard struggle a lot with many organizations questioning the reason for sharing when they themselves created a website for their own archive to share. So they're like, well, aren't you just here to steal our data? And our approach was always like, well, we're providing the alternative venue for the people around the world to be able to discover your archive, and we're not taking your data, although it looks like in the digital world your data is appearing in our platform, right? So there was a lot of political issue in terms of who owns what, and then like who is sharing whose information, and who's being credited, or how people are looking at the data available. So I'll just like put in the chat one of the example of the pictures, but I'll just pass the hand to somebody else.
Sorry, thank you. The complexities you describe, I mean, I just can't imagine the challenge in the midst of that work. John, I know you had your own challenges of a related but different kind. Could you please share?
Yeah, I'll just share via chat as well. There's a link to some of the stories that were based upon the archive. So the archive that I've put together, it has created a number of quite headline stories in Japan on TV news and front page of newspapers. So to kind of understand the challenges that I've experienced, could I just roughly explain some of the contents of the archive that will help to put it into context? So the documents in the archive, they contain quite groundbreaking information that nobody has understood about the current situation of the American military in Japan. First of all, some of the documents, they show extensive contamination on Okinawa today. And some of this contamination is on prime real estate near the capital of Okinawa Prefecture, Naha. Also, one of the most terrible revelations in the archives is that the military has contaminated the drinking water for 450,000 residents of Okinawa. That's about 1/3 of the population. And this is an ongoing problem. The water today is contaminated on Okinawa because of American military operations. And then finally, the archives show that the US Marine Corps, they were training new Marines to really look down on the people of Okinawa. The training lectures for the Marine Corps for new arrivals on Okinawa, they contain really derogatory comments against Okinawan people. They accuse Okinawan people of having double standards. They say Okinawan people will complain about anything just to get money. So the revelations in the archive, they created a lot of fuss in Japan when I wrote about them for my newspaper and also for TV. So understanding the impact of the documents should put into context the challenges that I've faced. So if you just look at the bottom left, on a personal level, the United States Marine Corps created a criminal file about me that I managed to obtain under FOIA. The United States Air Force, they blocked my internet service provider, probably to stop me from using their homepage to file FOIA requests. And then the American Embassy in Tokyo, they tried to interfere with a lecture that I gave at an American university in Tokyo. The embassy, the State Department, telephoned the university to complain about being selected as a speaker at that university. So on a personal level, there's been a lot of pushback, but also there has been a lot of failure to understand the context of these archives. I don't know how much you know about Okinawa and the relationship between Okinawa and mainland Japan, but sometimes it's quite fraught and it's quite tense. So when it comes to trying to have people use these archives and have people understand the context of these archives, there's been some reluctance to access them. For example, the mainland media in Japan, they rarely report about these violations that are ongoing in Okinawa. Also, among certain conservative elements in Japan, there's a disdain for people in Okinawa. They've looked down on the Okinawan democratic process for many, many years. Okinawans have repeatedly voiced their opposition to building a new megabase on Okinawa, but the mainland media and mainland conservatives, they don't listen to the voice of Okinawans. And also because this research is so new, because only now are we realizing the environmental impact of the military. Amongst colonial researchers, people interested in colonialism, they've been researching the Marshall Islands, they've been researching Puerto Rico, but they haven't yet located Okinawa within that context of colonialism and militarism when it comes to the environment and environmental justice. So this is a hurdle that I really feel that I personally need to work on. And as Professor Morimoto mentioned as well, there is also the technical challenges of putting together such a vast archive of documents. How to make them accessible to as many people as possible is a real challenge. For example, the Okinawa International University archives, they are on disk and they are on paper. So you'd need to actually visit the Ginowan City campus in order to access them. That's why I donated some of them to University of Hawaii and George Washington University to make access much easier. Also, how to visualize the data is another challenge. We've got them as paper documents, as text files, but how to put them onto a map to make them much more accessible is important. And finally, how to expand those documents as well. How to put oral testimony, how to put government records, how to put the FOIA obtained documents is a real challenge for me as well. So.
Thank you so much. And I'll note that in the teaching that we hope to support going forward from this symposium, a real goal is to expand the cases that we teach and think with to those places that often are kind of left out of public history and imagination. And so the case of Okinawa is a challenge for us to work on collectively. Professor Takahashi, can you please share your challenges?
Yes. First of all, can we share my several picture again? Okay.
Yes, please.
I think that if we think about the archiving project for the radiation influence to human body, we really need to think about these documents tend to be handled as the national security documents and the information because it starts from the Manhattan Project. It's the military project to develop the atomic bombing. And after the 1946 Atomic Energy Act was made, United States Atomic Energy Commission was established. And this federal government conducted the development of nuclear. So, so every information tend to be handled as the military and secret documents. So that's why the information on the suffering people tend to be classified and concealed. And even the, so let me back the picture. So let me explain my challenge. Sorry for it. So this is a picture of the National Archives. And I research in the college National Archives at the Washington, D.C. and also National Archives at College Park. And the Atomic Energy Commission documents located the National Archives in College Park. And when I research the National Archives at College Park, I found one empty envelope, and inside of the envelope, just one paper appeared. It said that this document was classified under the name of national security. So I found this paper in 2003 November. And then I requested a 4-year Freedom of Information Act to National Archives. And then half years later, I received the answer from National Archives. It said that the documents that you requested was declassified. And if you want and paid for the development, you can receive the pictures. And can you see the picture of the children, child?
Yes, we can see.
Okay.
Yes.
This is one of the picture that I requested for you. So this is a picture of the project 4.1. Maybe everybody know about the investigation of the Marshall Island people, titled "The Study of Responsible Human Beings Exposed to Significant beta and gamma radiation due to fallout from high-yield weapons." So such a medical picture was classified under the name of a classified document. And so can you see this material?
This
So
slide has
this
not.
is a record from the DOE, Department of Energy documents. It said a study of response of human being exposed to significant beta and gamma radiation due to fallout from high-yield weapons. And this research was conducted by AFSWP and AEC. AFSWP means the Armed Forces Special Weapon Project, which was established in 1946 or 7 by the military people. And Atomic Energy Commission was, as I explained, it was established in 1947. So military people and the Atomic Energy Commission investigated the Marshall Island people. And so let me explain about the Armed Forces Special Weapon Project. Before the nuclear test in Marshall Island in 1954, the Armed Forces Special Weapon Project tried to develop the radiation weapons. So Armed Forces Special Weapon Project is the project to develop of the radiological and chemical weapon, and also radiological weapons. So I think that a very horrible weapon this project try to make. So that means that including the information of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the radiation influence to human body documents was classified for the military purposes. So this is my challenge. So, and last year when I visited the National Archives again, before the Corona, the February last year, and I found the documents of the Department of Defense, and this is a box, and these are documents inside. So these documents was related to the radiological weapons. So I tried to challenge to get such documents, and as a next step, I need to challenge it to analyze this document. And I think that we need to make archives project for sharing such documents. So this is my challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Takahashi. I'll note that the challenge that you point to, a very, very expansive use of the kind of right to classify information, is something that we should return to in thinking about the archives and educational programs we need to build going forward. I know from my own research focused on toxic chemicals, advocacy and legislation supporting right to know has been very important. So as a group, we can consider what kinds of right to know advocacy need to be supported in order to build the knowledge infrastructure we need going forward. Nadine?
Hi there, yes. We want to also ask sort of what sort of things have you found draws people into the museums, the archives, the libraries that you've helped to construct? What sort of educational presentations or exhibits sort of seem to spark imagination and interest in your work? If we could start with Dr. Morimoto, that would be great.
Yes, so this is a very good question in the sense, like oftentimes that the people who work on building an archive on a particular topic, we do so because we're interested in the topic. And then we often forget that most other people are not as invested as you are. So the problem is, like, you build stuff thinking like, oh, once you build it, people's going to use it, but that's not often the case. We didn't realize that till, a couple of years after the project, and we realized the importance of doing a lot of outreach work, actually going to different, universities or the high schools, or even to the local communities, and show them why it's important, or if this thing we built is useful. And then, while thinking about answer to this question, and then listening to other panelists, it came to me one difference, the project I was involved on, and then other people have been working on, is this issue of secrecy or transparency. So many of your project worked with archives that things are hidden, secret. So that information is important, right? The project I worked on is the opposite, in the sense like we have so much information, which actually made it harder for us to know which information is actually important. because there was nobody protecting and saying like, well, this is important, so I'm not showing to you, right? And this is the kind of like experience like most of the users had to our archive, which hosted about like 1.2 million data points. Right? They said like, wow, that's great. You have lots of data, but what's important in here, right? So things we had to do is in a way like create the contents by topic or the theme, and it already sort of made ready, for people to explore. Otherwise, nobody had like a time and an interest really to dig in and then look into each data and assess and evaluate and put them together, right? So it's not only the archive, an archivist, but also there needs to be a group of researchers or the policymakers who are actively producing something out of it, and then just put that as a content available for a different kind of users who just come and expecting to get some important information in the archive. So that would be my point.
Thank you. Professor Takahashi, do you have examples of some of the outreach that you've done?
Professor Ryo's idea is very important, I think. To share the information and documents, we need to some skill to share. So the digitalization might be very important. If the documents information was digitalized, people can easy to share by putting the keyword and so on. So in my experience, when I was in the Nagoya University, I worked for the database of a SCAP, Supreme Command for the Allied Power documents. So occupation forces documents, and the SCAP made order to the Japanese imperial government. So this the project that I work for is the digitalizing of the order from the SCAP. So by making such database, we can, if we put the keyword like the keyword, we can access to the document itself. So I think that from my experience, this works very well. So so we need to find out the documents itself, but I think that it's really important to share, how to share. So it's a very big project, but maybe collaboration might be very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Professor Trowick.
I wanted to identify some materials that I see as archives, but we don't necessarily call them that. And I wanted to mention a website and a poster and a YouTube site and a digital art site. So, sorry, I just lost my link here. I'm going to say, first of all, I'll be posting all of this so that you get access to it. I'm not going to bother trying to show you all of this as I talk. There was one of the people who was collecting the medical records, the medical information about people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II, was Professor James Yamazaki, who later became a faculty member at UCLA. And he wrote many articles about his research, but eventually he also started a project at UCLA through the Center for Asian American Studies. And he called it the Children of the Atomic Bomb. And it's a very interesting website. Yes, Kim's just posted it here. And it's used as an educational site for children in kindergarten through high school, also for colleges. There's all kinds of people who use this site, And it's through it, there's many, many links to extraordinary wide array of activities. And I would contrast that with some archives that are at UCLA in the special collections at the library for Professor Stafford Warren, who became Dean of the UCLA Medical School. And because he was Dean of the medical school, his research records are in the special collections too. When I went to look at them, this is partly when Professor Takahashi was visiting UCLA, I was roaming around trying to find things that might interest. I realized that there were all these boxes that had been collected by Professor Warren's projects, including a lot of handwritten documents that were observations of Japanese doctors of their patients. It was mostly on pieces of paper about this size, written in pencil. And there are boxes of that stuff. And I would contrast that, which is, I talk about it in my classes, and it's almost never visited. But Professor Yamazaki's site, Children of the Atomic Bomb, is visited. So I think that's quite instructive. I wanted to mention that there's a very interesting poster. Let's see, just by the artist Akira Yamaguchi. It's the Paralympics poster for the Olympics, and it includes Fukushima. And he initially declined the project. He wasn't in favor of the Olympics, and he didn't see how it was helping Fukushima. But eventually, he designed this poster, and now I can see it's been put on the website here. And if you look carefully at the poster, it's a beautiful drawing, and it's got so much information about Fukushima and the memory practices and the events that happened there. So it's a kind of archive too, I would say. I want to mention a digital bombing map by Hashimoto, Isao Hashimoto. And it's an elegant visual display. And it's about 14 minutes, and it's just little blips all over the Pacific. And it's all the bomb test bombings all around the Pacific. It's really, you could just get caught up in watching it, and then all of a sudden you realize what it is. And then there's a lot of information to the side too. So it's another kind of archive, I would say. And then the last example I want to give is a collection that was started by Melissa Nelson, a professor at UC San Francisco, who's Native American. And she started talking with the people in the US Southwest whose land had been used for the test bombings and the destruction of the land through the atomic test bombings, nuclear test bombing. And she found that what they did, they weren't allowed back on the land, and partly because it was so dangerous during the testing, and then also from all the radiation. It's a toxic site. But they wanted to help heal the land. And they have songs that they sing to heal their land. And so they gather at fences and sing the songs. And it's another kind of secrecy. These are ritual practices that are not for outsider. So they want their next generation to learn the songs, to continue to stand at the fences and sing the songs to heal the land. It's a very powerful project. And it's the salt songs of the Wuovi people. And you can find a lot of information about this. It's called the Mojave Project now. And it's a very impressive archive, I think, with a very different use for secrecy. So all of these art projects, I think we need to think, sorry, we need, not talking too much during this pandemic. So I think we need to think about archives more broadly, and what's going to bring people into an archive through these websites, through these artworks, through these memory practices that lead us into other memory practices, that we can be part of this kind of memory hall, these mnemonic devices that lead us through all these different pathways. I think it's a very important kind of opening up the archive, and to keep in mind that, well, the first archives that I used as a student in history is the National Archives in France, the Archives Nationales. And that's when I learned that most archivists, national archivists, tend to think of their first job as preservation, not access. So all of us are talking about access. And so we need to think about how to design access, not just preservation. Thank you.
Mr. Mitchell, can you talk about some of your outreach practices to bring people into the archives you've developed?
Well, I'd like to keep my comments quite brief. First of all, as I explained previously, in the archives, there's a lot of information related to Okinawa culture, Okinawa history, Okinawa politics, as well as the environmental impact as well. So I'm really happy that a wide variety of researchers have been accessing the documents and using them for their own specific fields. The photographs of the Koza riot, they've been used in many art projects by students, especially because we had the anniversary of the Koza riot last year. So first of all, there's the academic context that a lot of researchers are accessing it and using it. Much more importantly for me is that hundreds of American veterans are sick. Many Americans who served on Okinawa, their family members, they are ill, they're dying from exposures to toxic substances on Okinawa. So I've been trying to reach out to the veterans organizations via the American military newspaper, Stars and Stripes, via the Department of Veterans Affairs, just to tell these veterans that these documents are available and these documents can be used by their healthcare providers to help them to get benefits from the American government. So for me, the ultimate goal as a journalist is to make impact for regular people's lives. And fortunately, to date, more than a dozen veterans have managed to get their benefits approved by the Department of Veterans Affairs, thanks to some of the documents that we've been uploading to this archive. And finally, I'd just like to say, I had quite an interesting experience 4 years ago, where I wrote a series of newspaper articles about contamination on Okinawa. And I found out the following year that the Japanese government had asked the American military, can we have John Mitchell's documents, please? So that was a real eye-opener for me, that actually I had documents that the Japanese government didn't have access to. So by putting all of these reports out there for anybody to obtain and anybody to access, I really hope that they can help as many people in as many different ways as possible.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mitchell. As organizers, we have many more questions we would like to ask. And I certainly will ask if we don't have any from the audience, but we'll take a few questions now from the audience. I think we have some queued up. Okay, a first question we have is about the archives of health records and how those are a special type of archive. And this actually gets to the general question of what different kinds of data, whether it be oral histories or pollution records or health records, how do we think about the heterogeneity of data types that are in play in trying to understand complex problems like toxic contamination? Does anyone want to take that question?
I'll just start by pointing out, well, I think on the last panel, other panels will be hearing more about this, but just as Professor Takahashi has been mentioning, a great deal of the data about the bombs and the nuclear testing was kept secret for a very long time during the Cold War. And it was opened up under the Clinton, a lot of that data were opened up under the Clinton administration, but just because the data were open didn't mean that it was accessible. And as Professor Morimoto has been saying, you need funding to get the curators in to start sorting through everything. And access doesn't necessarily follow quickly. And then when Bush became president, they tried to shut it back down, but eventually it opened up. And Native American communities all over the Southwest have been very, very active in accessing those records because a lot of their own health was documented throughout the Cold War period. We're talking about here 45 to about 95. All those health records were considered classified, and yet these were people's bodies. And as John was saying, that these people, their own health records were not accessible to them under many circumstances. So when we're talking about heterogeneity of talking just a subject of health, we have to be thinking about the global political economy within which an individual's health records might be embodied. And then also the whole classification system around their diagnoses could have been shaped based on the needs and goals of the people keeping the records rather than the health practitioners.
Are there other, Dr. Morimoto?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say a few things. One is that, I think in the context of this particular panel, we've been talking a lot about the sort of environmental contamination, negative adverse health effect and all that. But also, radiation is used for the medical purposes too. And one of the things that one of the things I've been looking into is the medical exposure, which hasn't been discussed much. Once you kind of start including medical exposure into the picture, there's an interesting sort of distribution appears, that is like poor groups get exposed forcefully by the environmental contamination on the one hand, and the rich people voluntarily seek to get exposed through the medical exposure. And oftentimes we don't think about it, but if we really think of radiation exposure as coming from the radioisotopes, right? They're the same thing. So, that's one interesting thing that we can think about, especially in Japanese. The word radiation is spelled in two different ways. One is from the bombs, hibaku, the language, the character used to describe, the exposure from the bombs. The other is hibaku is any type of exposure, including the exposure from the cosmic rays and analytical and otherwise, right? So when the Fukushima happened, this language confused people because, it sounds the same in the speech, but in written language, there was a fine-tuned distinction, right? So I think the question I'm asking here is like, when we talk about radiation, what kind of radiation we're thinking about including in terms of creating the archive. And another thing is to think about the isotopes themselves as the archive, because it has a very different temporalities, right? So one of the positive thing, if I may say, about the Fukushima is the general awareness of the omnipresence of radiation, and also people now have access to the technological instrument with which they can measure, right? So the rise of citizen science and all that. So there are, different ways of gathering data about radiations, which might change the way that, we think of or we approach, thinking about creating the archive related to, radiation related, events or other stuff. So just my comments.
Thank you. And I'll note that in my lecture last week, I recalled that a really powerful moment in the discussions I was in Japan after the Fukushima disaster brought specialists responsible for worker health and community health in conversation with like a pediatric radiologist, whose responsibility was to kind of tinker with the machine and get the dosage right for different kinds of care. And it was the different ways that they understood the hazards and the possibilities was powerful. And so I think one of our goals here is to purposely bring together these different ways of thinking about hazards just to generate new insight. I'm going to interpret a couple of the questions in the chat succinctly to ask, in the work that you've done, all of you have dealt with, even if you've had to work for it, dealt with a large quantity of data. And so I'll interpret these questions to say, in working with all that data, have you gained insight into other data that you've realized we need? Because even in the voluminous amounts of data you've worked with, you've realized the limitations. Mr. Mitchell?
For me, like you said, I've had voluminous data from the American military. And one of the things that struck me is the military has its own language. There's so much jargon and there's so many technical phrases that are not understandable to outsiders. So for me, I've been doing my best to keep a notebook of all these different synonyms and acronyms and just variety of new words, and just to share them with people to help them to understand how the military talks about these different issues, because the way these issues are talked about by the general public is really different. A few years ago, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request about the crime rate in the military, and I didn't get any records back because they don't refer to military infractions as crime. They usually refer to them as a discipline issue. So for me, researching this issue, it has been learning a foreign language for me. So I can really understand the barriers to other researchers researching these ideas. And also there does tend to be a snowball effect, where when you get one document, within the document, they will reference other documents. And so you can use those references to file for your next Freedom of Information Act request. So I really think that it's an onion. And when you peel it through those different layers, you can just get so much more information. It's extracted and share it with other people and share that knowledge as well.
And this reminds of Professor Takahashi's
Yes.
suggestion that we curate keywords that we can use to
Mm,
enhance discoverability. And certainly you have to speak the language of the databases that you're working in. And I'll mention a challenge that I worry a lot about is that we want the archives you're building today to be vital for people 2 or 3 decades out in many places. So how do we build metadata and search functionality for people that are not going to be thinking like we are? And so just the real conceptual challenges of this work, I think Professor Takahashi got us thinking in that direction as well. Are there other responses to this question? Yes, Professor Takahashi.
Can I talk? Thank you for mentioning me. I would like to remind you that I introduced the documents of the Shigemitsu and Ambassador Allison documents. So I think that the National Archives of Record Administration in the United States is very organized compared to the archives in Japan. And also the Japanese government doesn't have enough archiving system. So I think that as a first step, we need to access to the National Archives in the United States or other facility. And then after getting the documents, based on this document, we can request the FOIA to Japanese government or other governments. So because of using this technique, I could get the declassified document from Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan. Otherwise, I think that I cannot get such documents. So maybe we need to share such information. Thank you.
Other responses?
Professor Sugawara has a comment.
Okay.
Professor Sugawara, we can't hear you.
Sorry, he's turned off. Is he muted?
Of
And
course.
no, we're having audio problems.
We're near the end of our session. So I'd like to ask you all to consider how the issues we've raised here we can return to in our session next Monday, focused on radiation regulation. And one thing I hear in our most recent exchange is the question of what kind of regulation do we need, or what kind of legislation to create the archival record that can be the knowledge base for the future. Also, the other side, as Professor Morimoto has emphasized, is that we need legislation to enable the interpretation of those archives. I mean, we know in so many disaster contexts that there's a lot of information, just very limited capacity to make sense of it, so to speak. And so imagine the way that we could be proactive to address the range of issues responded here through the legislative and regulatory process that will be our focus next week. Is Professor Sugawara, is his audio is still? So I think that we'll save that comment, and we welcome you to join us next Monday at the same time in Japan, but at 6 p.m. Here in the United States, because we will have a time change. And we welcome your feedback beforehand. Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Tanio or Professor Trowick, do you have closing comments?
No, thank you. I would like to hear from Professor Sugawara if he's now got the sound on.
I'm still not seeing an audio feed at all.
Okay.
Does Professor Sugawara, do you want to put something in the chat? Or just hold until next week? Oh wait, I'm now seeing, Professor Sugawara, I'm now seeing that you're muted. Can you unmute? The audio is at least visible. No, okay. All right, we will return to Professor Sugawara's comments next week, and we hope all of you will join us. Thank you so much to the panelists. Just really, really insightful commentary that we have so much to learn from.